contact log. October the 14th, 0640 hours. I want to get this down while the numbers still make sense to me, because in about 6 hours they stopped making sense, and they haven't come back around since. At 0640 I was standing at the trail junction where the old fire road splits off the maintained loop, and I checked my GPS the way you check it 40 times on any given patrol, out of habit more than need. Elevation, easting, northing, standard 4-second refresh. The unit gave me 2 different 8-digit grid references, about 0.4 of a mile apart, for the exact same spot I was standing on. I turned to face the other direction and checked it again. The numbers swapped, not drifted. Swapped, like the unit was reading 2 locations and alternating between them depending on which way I was pointed. I logged it as a maintenance flag. Battery, antenna corrosion, something for the equipment tech to look at Monday. I need that on the record because I want it understood that I did not walk into Section 9 that morning expecting anything. I walked in annoyed at a $140 handheld unit that couldn't hold a fix. I've got 6 years in this district. Before that, 4 seasons on a hotshot crew out west. I say that not to establish credentials for their own sake, but because I want it clear that what I'm describing isn't the account of somebody spooked by an owl on his first solo patrol. I know what mountain silence sounds like. I know what a black bear track looks like at 4 different gates. I know the particular quality of unease that comes from low blood sugar and bad sleep, and I know the difference between that and something else. This was something else. Section 9 is a 40-acre grid cell in the southeast corner of the district, bounded on one side by a dry creek bed that only runs in April, and on the other by roughly a mile of 1930 CCCA-era fire road that was decommissioned before I was born and doesn't appear on any map printed after 1974. It's old growth in there, hemlock mostly, some of it 4 feet at the base. Canopy closed enough that the understory is mostly bare duff and rhododendron thickets you have to turn sideways to get through. Cell signal is 1 bar, if that, and only if you're standing on the ridge at the north corner. We don't send crews in there without reason. There isn't much reason. It's not scenic. There's no water feature worth a trail, and the trail junction inside it, the one I was standing at, leads nowhere anybody wants to go. There's a standing internal note on Section 9 in the district SOP binder, added sometime before my transfer, that I'd read exactly once, and forgotten about until that morning. Any ranger entering the grid cell solo is required to radio a check-in every 30 minutes rather than the standard 60. And any patrol lasting longer than 4 hours triggers an automatic call-out regardless of contact status. Nobody had ever explained the shorter interval to me directly. I'd assumed, when I first read it, that it was leftover liability language from some incident before my time, the kind of overcautious policy that accumulates in a rural district binder and never gets cleaned out. I want to be honest that I did not follow it that morning. 30 minutes felt excessive for a welfare check. I expected to close out in under an hour, so I set my own check-in for the standard 60 and didn't think about it again until much later when it was the only part of the SOP that turned out to matter. The reason I was there that morning was a permit discrepancy. A solo backpacker, permit under the name T. Colley, had checked in 4 days earlier for a 3-night stay with an expected checkout of October the 13th, 1800 hours at the self-registration kiosk half a mile from the main trailhead. Checkout hadn't happened. Standard protocol on an overdue solo is a welfare check at the last confirmed camp location before we escalate to a full search and rescue call-out. Mostly because 8 times out of 10 the hiker lost track of a day, or their truck wouldn't start, or they're sitting in a diner 40 miles away completely unaware anyone's looking for them. Colley's stated camp location, written on the permit in blue ballpoint, was the trail junction in Section 9. That's an odd choice. There's no established campsite there. But people make odd choices, and it's not our job to second-guess a permit, just to check it. A trail crew doing hazard tree assessment had come through the area 2 days prior and radioed in that they'd found a torn guy line and a bent tent stake near the junction, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. Gear gets left, gear gets damaged, it happens. It wasn't flagged as a welfare concern until the permit came up overdue and somebody cross-referenced the location. Standard protocol for an overdue permit at more than 24 hours calls for a 2-person welfare check, not a solo. I went in alone that morning because the overdue flag had come through the system logged as an 8-hour delay rather than a 36-hour one, a data entry error, We determined afterward on the kiosk sync that uploads permit statuses to the district server only once daily, at midnight, meaning Colley's non-checkout hadn't actually been visible to anyone until that morning's sync, well after the window. It should have been caught in. 8 hours reads as routine. 36 reads as a full call-out. I was given the 8-hour version, and I made the entirely reasonable decision, based on the information I had, to go take a look myself before pulling a second ranger off other duties for what I expected to be a non-event. So, D640, Trail Junction, 2 conflicting GPS readings, 1 torn guy line reported by a trail crew, 1 missing camper. That's the whole of what I knew going in. I did my radio check at 0645. Cross Fork, this is Unit 14, radio check, over. Unit 14, Cross Fork, you're 5x5, go ahead, copy. I'm 1020 at the Section 9 junction, beginning welfare check on overdue permit, Colley, T estimated, 1 hour on site, will advise. Over. Copy, 14, 1 hour, we'll have you on the board, Cross Fork out. I want you to remember that exchange. 0645, 1 hour estimated. I'm going to come back to it. The first 400 yards past the junction, everything read normal. Duff underfoot, standard hemlock and rhododendron structure. The kind of quiet you get in a closed canopy in fall when the leaf litter insects have mostly gone dormant. I noted the quiet, but I didn't flag it. October, quiet isn't June quiet, and I've walked plenty of dead, still October mornings that turned out to be nothing. About 200 yards further, the fire road announced itself the way it always does out there. A waist-high wooden post, CCC era, weathered gray, with Sector 9 and a set of numbers cut into it by hand sometime in 1938, according to district history. Below that, cut shallower and in a different hand, someone had added closed and a second set of digits I'd never paid attention to on previous patrols because I'd never had reason to. I stopped this time. The closure date read 10/14, no year, cut deep enough into the grain that whoever carved it had taken real time over it. October the 14th, the same date as the patrol I was on. I photographed it, told myself it was a coincidence of a 2-digit month-day format that would inevitably repeat every year on any post carved with enough dates on it, and kept walking. I've since gone back through the district's digitized closure records for Section 9. There is no recorded closure for any year on October the 14th. There's no recorded closure at all. What I did flag in my notebook at approximately 0705 was the blaze marks. This district switched from orange paint blazes to blue diamond tags in 2011, 3 years before I transferred in. I know that because it's in the trail maintenance log I update every spring. The blazes I was seeing on the hemlock trunks along the old fire road were orange. Old orange, the kind that should have weathered to a dull rust after over a decade of exposure. These hadn't. They were bright enough that I checked one at close range for tackiness in case somebody had been out here repainting an old route without authorization. Dry to the touch. Just unweathered, and they were high. Standard blaze height is 5 to 6 feet, eye level for a person walking the trail. These were closer to 9 or 10 feet up the trunk. I noted it, took a photo for the file, kept moving. I told myself somebody on an old survey crew had used a different marking convention decades back, and I was looking at paint that had somehow, improbably, held its color in low light and dense shade. I did not, at 0705, believe that explanation. I wrote it down anyway, because that's the job. You write down what you observe, not what you've decided to believe. At 0722 I found the campsite. It matched the trail crew's report, a 2-person tent, collapsed on one side where a stake had pulled, guy line torn rather than untied, the kind of tear you get from tension, not wear. What the trail crew hadn't mentioned, because they hadn't gone inside, was the sleeping bag. It was zipped, fully zipped, pulled up and closed from the outside, a physical impossibility for a person to do to themselves from inside a mummy bag with a single side zipper. I've camped in some version of that bag design for 15 years. You cannot zip yourself in past your shoulders without help. Somebody, or something, had zipped that bag shut after whoever was in it either got out or stopped being in a position to do it themselves. The stove was still primed, half a canister of fuel left, cold. A single boot, right foot, size 11, sat upright about 6 feet from the tent door. laces still tied in a double bow, as though someone had stepped out of it rather than untied it. The backpack was propped against a hemlock a few feet off, still fully loaded, 3 days of food, a water filter, a paperback with a boarding pass used as a bookmark at around the halfway point. Tucked in the top lid pocket was a small spiral notebook, the kind you'd use for a trip journal, with entries for the first 2 nights. The second night's entry was 4 lines long and ended without a period, the pen pressure trailing off the edge of the page, as if the hand holding it had simply stopped mid-motion rather than finished the thought. The last legible words were a note about hearing. Something respond to a whistle collie said they'd used out of habit to check for other hikers in range. A short 2-note pattern, the kind you'd use to signal a companion. According to the entry, something out past the tree line had whistled the same 2 notes back, in the same order, close enough that Collie wrote down a distance estimate, maybe 40 yards. There was no third night's entry. I called it in. Cross Fork, Unit 14. Go ahead 14. I'm at the reported camp location, Section 9 Junction. Tents collapsed, 1 guy line torn through, not untied. Gears present, stove, pack, 1 boot. No sign of the permit holder. Requesting you log this as upgraded to active search and get me an ETA on backup. Over. There was a pause longer than radio lag accounts for. Copy that. 14, be advised. We already have your 0840 transmission on file reporting the same. You said you'd continue on to the second junction and advise. That was 18 minutes ago. We were about to call you. I looked at my watch. It read 0722. I had not made a transmission at 0840 because 0840 hadn't happened yet. I told dispatch that, and there was another pause, and the dispatcher, a woman named Reyes, I've worked with for 4 years and trust as much as I trust anybody in this district, said slowly that she had a logged transmission in my voice, time-stamped 0840, and that if I wanted, she could play it back to me over the radio right now. I told her not to. I don't know why I told her not to. I've thought about that decision more than almost anything else that happened that day. I kept moving toward the second junction, the one the phantom transmission had apparently mentioned, a location I hadn't reached yet and hadn't told anyone I intended to reach, because until that moment I hadn't known there was a second junction. But the old fire road forked about 300 yards past the campsite, something not on my map, not on any map I'd ever worked from in this district, and something told me, I'll use that softer word because I don't have a harder one that's honest, that the fork was where I needed to go. It was there, walking the left branch of that fork, that I found the boot prints in the dry creek bed. A single, isolated print, pressed into the cracked mud at the edge of the water line that hadn't held water since spring. Barefoot, or close enough to it, 5 toe impressions, but spaced wrong, splayed at an angle no human forefoot naturally takes, and the depth of the impression suggested a great deal more weight than the print's length would account for. I measured it. 11.5 inches, heel to toe. My own boot is 11. The stride length to the next print, because there was a next print, 31 feet further down the creek bed, was roughly 9.5 feet. I am 6'1". My own natural stride, moving fast, tops out around 5.5 feet. I've tracked black bear through creek mud more times than I can count, and a bear print, even a big one, reads differently. 5 toes, but round, compact claws registering ahead of the pad. This wasn't that. The weight distribution ran heavier on what would be the outside edge of the foot, the kind of asymmetry you'd associate with something that doesn't walk on all fours, and doesn't walk quite like we do either. I crouched over it longer than I should have, running my knowledge of every game species in this district against what I was looking at, and coming up with nothing that matched cleanly. I want to be clear that I did not, in that moment, decide it was anything in particular. I decided it was unclassifiable, logged it as such, and made the choice, one I've gone back and forth on since, to keep moving forward rather than turn back for backup at that point. I photographed both prints, logged the GPS coordinates, which, I noted almost as an aside in my own recording, read as one single consistent number for the first time all day, no split, no swap, and continued along the second fork at approximately 09110 by my own count. Though I want to be honest that my sense of elapsed time from this point forward is something I no longer fully trust. I found the ammunition box. It was a rusted steel field surplus box, the kind used for waterproof document storage on backcountry assignments before radios and GPS units made most of that record-keeping. Obsolete, wedged into a gap between two hemlock roots about 40 feet off the fork, half buried in duff that looked undisturbed for years, maybe decades. Inside, in a sealed plastic sleeve, was a field notebook, water-damaged at the edges but legible, signed with initials matching a district ranger who, according to the personnel history I later confirmed at the office, had worked this exact patrol area from 1985 to 1988 before transferring out and, per his file, never taking another assignment involving backcountry solo patrol again. The entry dated October the 11th, 1987, described an overdue solo camper at the Section 9 junction, a torn tent, a GPS unit, an early model, one of the first the district issued, giving two coordinate readings for a single location, exactly 4/10 of a mile apart, depending on the direction the ranger was facing when he checked it. Flipping back through the earlier pages, I found two more entries in the same hand, both undated, both shorter, both describing what the ranger called, in his own words, the whistle thing. An exchange similar to what I'd later learned Kali had written in their own trip journal, a signal given and a signal returned from somewhere past visual range. In the margin of one entry, in different ink, someone had added a single line, told R, not to log this one. I don't know who R was. I don't know whether the notebook's original author wrote that line himself later or whether somebody else added it afterward. Handwriting analysis isn't something I have access to out here, and by the time I thought to ask for it, the notebook had already been logged into evidence, and I no longer had it in my possession to send anywhere. I want to be precise about what that number did to me, reading it in that clearing. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was the specific, cold recognition of realizing that the detail I'd logged 11 hours earlier as equipment malfunction, a detail I hadn't mentioned to dispatch, hadn't mentioned to anyone, had barely mentioned to myself, was sitting in a 37-year-old field notebook written in another ranger's hand, describing my morning down to the decimal point. The 1987 entry ended mid-sentence. There was no second notebook in the box. I called it in. This time I made myself say all of it, the notebook, the date, the matching coordinate discrepancy, because I needed it on record with someone other than myself, in case what happened next happened to me the way it had, I now had to assume, happened to whoever wrote that entry. Crossfork, Unit 14. I need you to log something unusual, and I need you to log it exactly as I say it. Go ahead, 14. Reyes's voice had a different quality to it now, careful. I gave her the notebook details. I gave her the coordinates of the second fork. I told her I intended to follow it another quarter mile to what I now believed was an older original survey junction that predated the current trail system, because the 1987 entry referenced the true post, a phrase that meant nothing to me until I was standing 40 feet from a rotted wooden survey marker, a half swallowed by a hemlock's root collar, its carved numbers still faintly legible under decades of moss, a boundary post older than the CCC road itself, marking what must have once been 2 mile to the northeast, the exact number, half swallowed by a hemlock's root collar, its carved numbery post older than the CCC road itself, marking what must have once been the actual original corner of Section 9. Before some later research, the unit wasn't malfunctioning. It had been reading both boundaries the entire time, the old one and the new one, as if, out here, both were still equally true. Reyes's response is where the second thing happened. Copy all that, 14. But I need you to confirm something on your end, because dispatch has you on record radioing in those same coordinates, word for word, the boundary post, the resurvey distance, all of it at 0840 this morning. I've got you on tape. I'm looking at the transcript right now. It's time-stamped 40 minutes before you say you found the notebook. I stood at that post for a long moment without answering her. Then I told her, as flatly as I could manage, that I needed her to do one more thing, check whether permit holder Kali's kiosk checkout had been logged. There was a pause, keys typing on the other end. Yeah, she said, checked out, 11:40 this morning. Kiosk's got a photo capture on checkout, standard procedure, you know that. Pull the photo. Another pause. Longer this time. 14. The photos, the timestamps right, the permit numbers right, but the image quality's bad. Face isn't clear. I can send it to your unit, but I don't think it's going to help you. It didn't matter. I already understood, standing at that post with the moss-eaten numbers under my thumb, that whoever or whatever had checked that kiosk out at 11:40 that morning was not going to be findable by a face in a low-resolution photograph, and that the search for T. Colley, as a matter of departmental record, was about to be closed as resolved, and that I was the only person in this district who was ever going to know it hadn't been. I turned to head back toward the main junction. That's when I found the third set of prints. Boot prints. My boot prints. The specific worn pattern of my own right sole, which has a distinctive crescent gap in the tread from a rock strike 2 seasons back, a pattern I would know anywhere because I've followed my own tracks back out of the woods more times than I can count, pressed into the duff behind me, heading in the direction I had just come from, fresh enough that the displaced leaf litter hadn't finished settling. I had not walked that ground. I had come from the other direction. I'm not going to spend a long time describing what happened over the next 11 minutes, because I've given that account, in full, to people whose job it is to evaluate it, and I don't believe repeating it here changes anything about what's true. What I'll say is this: I ran the way you run when your body has made a decision. Your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Back down the fork, back past the true post, back past the campsite with its zipped, empty sleeping bag, back toward the dry creek bed that marked the boundary of Section 9 on every map printed after 1974. I went down once, hard, over a root system I would normally have cleared without thinking about it, and came up with a torn palm and a bent radio antenna and kept moving because stopping to assess the damage felt, in that moment, like a luxury I did not have. My pack strap had come loose somewhere in the fall, and I left it that way, half off one shoulder, rather than take the 2 seconds to fix it. I remember the specific smell of crushed rhododendron leaf, sharp and green, because I went through a stand of it at a dead run, and it's the kind of detail that apparently lodges itself permanently in a person's memory under enough adrenaline. I remember counting my own steps at one point. A habit from wildland fire training meant to regulate breathing under exertion, and losing count somewhere past 40 and not starting over. Somewhere behind me, close enough that I could hear displaced brush and the specific weight shift of something moving through rhododendron at a pace that should not have been sustainable on that terrain. Something was keeping pace with me. I did not look back. I want that understood clearly, because people ask, and the honest answer is that I made a decision very early in that run not to know what I was looking at, and I have not regretted that decision once since. At the edge of the dry creek bed, the actual, current, legally surveyed boundary of Section 9, the sound behind me stopped. Not faded. Stopped, the way a recording stops, mid-motion, at the exact line of cracked mud and river stone that the current map calls the edge of the grid cell. I crossed it. I did not stop moving again until I hit the maintained loot trail nearly a mile later, where a response team, dispatched, I later learned, at Reyes's own initiative against protocol, the moment she pulled that kiosk photo, found me sitting against a tree, radio still keyed open, having said nothing into it for 11 straight minutes. Colley's case was closed as a resolved checkout. Departmental record. The gear from the tent was recovered, logged, and released to a listed emergency contact who, per the file, never responded to any of the 3 notification attempts. I've asked, quietly, twice, what happened to that gear afterward. Nobody in records seems to know. I haven't gone back into Section 9. I've had 2 direct requests to do so, 1 routine boundary resurvey, 1 hazard tree follow-up, and I've declined both, and my supervisor, who has read this account, has not asked me to reconsider. The 30-minute check-in requirement is still in the binder. I know, because I'm the one who retyped it last spring during our annual SOP review, and I added a line to it myself this time, something I have the authority to do as senior ranger on this district now. Any solo welfare check inside Section 9 requires a 2-person team, no exceptions, effective immediately. Nobody on staff has asked me why. I suspect a few of them already know better than to ask. Here's what I'll leave you with, because I think it's the only part of this that doesn't depend on you believing me. Go to the main trailhead. Walk the loop to the Section 9 junction. It's an easy 2-mile hike, well within the current boundary, nothing dangerous about the walk itself. Take out any standard GPS unit. Check your coordinates facing north, then turn and face south, and check them again. They won't match. They'll be off by exactly 0.4 of a mile in the same direction every time for anyone who checks. Equipment techs have looked at it. Nobody's fixed it. Nobody's explained it. It's just there, a documented discrepancy, sitting in a maintenance log under my initials, waiting for whoever checks next.